Let's turn our attention to what's going on in Central America because El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele is going viral. Last week, the president surprised his entire cabinet by calling them together to announce that they're under investigation for corruption. In a video posted to X, he asks the Attorney General, the only person present who is not part of his government's executive branch, to look into allegations of bribery involving all members of the cabinet.
Como pueden ver ustedes todos, los que estamos aquí reunidos son parte del Ejecutivo, del órgano ejecutivo, que es el del cual yo estoy encargado, a excepción de una persona. Es el fiscal general que está aquí, él no es del Ejecutivo. Y está acá por una razón bien sencilla. Y es porque le quiero pedir en público de que investiguemos a todos los que están acá.
Joining us for more on this is policy analyst on Latin America at the Cato Institute, Daniel Raisbeck. Daniel, thank you for joining us once again on Power Hour. It's pretty rare that you see this in politics. And before we get your reaction to the video, can you tell us about who President Nayib Bukele is?
Right. Well, what you see in the video is Bukele launching a, quote, war against corruption. I think it's a continuation of his war against crime. El Salvador has been, during the last few decades, one of the most violent countries in Latin America and, in fact, in the world. And this has, of course, changed with Bukele, who came to power around 5 years ago. And he has imposed very drastic measures against criminal gangs. So over 70,000 suspects are now in a very high security prison. And this has made El Salvador from one of the most violent countries in the world to one of the least violent in the region. On the other hand, this has been done by violating all types of due process. And Bukele has done several moves that have really gone against the rule of law. In 2020, for instance, he entered as president Congress with the army in order to force legislators to approve a loan to his government. So there's already several instances of Bukele really installing the early stages of an autocratic regime. He's tremendously popular. He was just reelected, even though there wasn't supposed to be a re-election according to the Salvadoran constitution, which he changed. So on the one hand, he's tremendously popular. He has definitely solved the issue of crime for the time being. On the other hand, he has used very questionable methods, in my opinion, but he remains popular. And in the video, you saw him now trying to wage a war against corruption. And critics will say that it's not entirely transparent either, because, for instance, his attorney general is not as independent as it seems. And there has already been at least one profile arrest recently, one of his commissioners or top advisors. But as I mentioned, critics maintain that in order to have a war against corruption, the first thing you have to have is a division of powers and an independent judiciary, which in El Salvador, apparently you no longer have.
It's pretty interesting that there's already been one high-profile arrest. Do you see more being made?
Probably, especially if Bukele wants to portray himself not only as the victor in the war against crime, but also in the war against corruption. But again, I think in a certain sense, Bukele has won because there hasn't been very many times when the president of El Salvador is discussed outside of Central America or in the region, let alone across the Anglo-speaking world. On the other hand, as I mentioned, his tactics have been very heavy-handed, and we've seen it in the region, in Latin America, so many times where presidents are elected democratically and according to the rules and according to the Constitution, and they change the Constitution in order to stay in power. So we've seen it in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in so many countries, in Nicaragua, just to say in Central America. So the question is how long Bukele will stay. Until now, he is able to stay for 5 more years, but there's already talk of extending that for another 5 years. He is tremendously popular, and his party controls the vast majority of Congress, where there is no longer any type of valid opposition. So the question is to what extent there can be any rules or checks on his power, and of of course, power corrupts, and this is something that we're looking at closely in Central America.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? As you say, his party, New Ideas, now holds 90% of the seats, granting substantial influence over legislative decisions, including the possible alterations to the constitution for his re-election. How likely is it that this will go ahead?
I think it is likely. It looks likely at this point. It doesn't look like he has any intention to just step down at the end of this term, even though it just started. Personally, I would hope that he does, in order to have some type of rule of law in El Salvador, even though, admittedly, the system as it stood before failed completely in order to solve the main problem, which was criminality, which Bukele has indeed really cracked down on crime, and that's why I think you see his tremendous levels of popularity. The question is how long you can maintain that, because again, there have been numerous leaders in the region who have had, even with somewhat similar policies, very high levels of popularity. But it's only a matter of time until you detect all types of abuses. So there are all types of organizations that have already denounced the lack of habeas corpus, for instance, and people being rounded in just for being suspects and being in jail now for several years. So that's something that you have to look at as well, not only the figures in terms of crime, but also how they're going about bringing that into effect.